remarkable life and legacy of Jimmy Carter, someone whose legacy will go well beyond his 4 years in office. Tell us some of your thoughts this morning as you reflect upon his life.
Well, it looks like 100's about the limit, isn't it? I mean, it really looks like that's as long as you can live, because he did everything right. He taught us that the American presidency is not a transaction where you get something for it. It's what you give to it. And clearly that's what he did. And I think about how hard it was for people talk about the post-presidency being more important. Well, that's one argument, I guess. But you know what the really truth was? How in hell did this guy ever get elected president of the United States? Nobody knew who he was in 1974. Nobody. He wasn't on any poll. He didn't show up anywhere. He was a lame duck governor of a deep South state. He was not on the charts for anybody. And then he became, well, he won all the primaries, basically. And how did he do it? In 1974, 2 years before he ran for president, he sent out letters to all the people that lost Democratic primaries. I got one in Philadelphia. I got one of those letters congratulating me for making the effort and inviting me to get involved, not just in Pennsylvania, but around the country. This is how he built his campaign. Then he began sleeping on people's couches. And as Ted Sorensen, who wrote speeches for Jack Kennedy, said, once somebody has slept on your couch, it's pretty hard to vote against them. He built it up gradually, piece by piece, the peanut grenade parade, and he put it all together and managed to knock off everybody in Iowa and then in New Hampshire and Pennsylvania, and he beat George Wallace and all the rest of them. It was a hell of a campaign, piece by piece. And later on in the presidency, when I was a speechwriter for him, I learned what Jimmy Carter was about. He's a man who believes in doing it yourself. I delivered a speech to him at 4 o'clock in the morning. The coffee was perking. He was up already like a farmer, which he was for years, a farmer. And he was already working away on his decision memoranda. He loved when he could get an 80-point questionnaire from Stu Eisenstadt, his great domestic advisor. He wanted all the facts and figures. He wanted to be all the decisions himself. And that was his undoing. He believed in doing everything piece by piece, like an engineer, like Herbert Hoover, unfortunately, instead of the grand sweep of things. I think Ronald Reagan, if he had had the hostages grabbed in his world, he would have declared war and said, that's an act of war. That's an act of war, you Iranians. I want those people back by 24 hours or we're going to war with you guys. Carter saw it as like sort of a criminal act with a bunch of kids, college students, grabbing our people, our diplomats. I think he was perhaps too granular. That's probably was his undoing.
So, Michael Beschloss, in your estimation, how will the long lens of history remember former President Carter? What are some things that you feel Americans should be considering this morning?
I think, a few of them would be, Jonathan, how he changed this political culture. For instance, for most of American history, there is no way that Jimmy Carter would have been nominated by his party for president of the United States. Before the rules were changed in around 1970 to make primaries more important and to reduce the influence of elected officials and party bosses. If those party bosses and elected officials had made the choice in 1976, it would not have been Jimmy Carter, a one-term governor of Georgia, whom most people did not know in that party. Instead, it would have been someone like Hubert Humphrey, the former vice president and senator from Minnesota. So he was an emblem of the opening of the door. If you're looking at Donald Trump and the way that Donald Trump was able to get nominated in 2016, he was able to do that as part of a popular groundswell. If the 2016 election and nomination had been just a poll of party leaders, there's no way that Donald Trump would have been nominated. Another big change at the time among many was Carter's religion. This is probably the most deeply religious candidate for president of modern times. And that has been true elsewhere in American history. It turns out, for instance, that Harry Truman was a very religious man, but he concealed it because he thought that that would be, deterring to people, that they would be put off by it. In Carter's case, he said, you may not know me, but one thing you should know about me is, and these are the words he used, my deep Christian faith. And that was shorthand for a lot of people, even who were not Christian, for the fact that this was a person of strong character who could be relied on as a president of the United States, even though, as Chris Matthews said, very few people knew very much about it.
So President Biden issued public remarks yesterday on the life of President Carter. Biden last saw Carter in November 2023 at Rosalind Carter's funeral, where he said he took the time to tell the former president how much he loved him, while also agreeing to deliver a eulogy at his funeral. Let's take a listen to some of what President Biden had to say yesterday.
Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds. Just look at his life's work. He worked to eradicate disease, not just at home, but around the world. He forged peace, advanced civil rights, human rights, promoted free and fair elections around the world. He built housing for the homeless with his own hands. And his compassion and moral clarity lifted people up and changed lives and saved lives all over the globe. I'll always cherish having seen Jimmy and Rosalind Carter together. Theirs was a love affair of the ages. While we'll miss them both dearly, I do take some solace in our kids were saying it, that they're united once again. They're going to remain forever in our hearts. But they're together again.
So, Reverend Al, let's get your thoughts here as to what President Carter meant to the struggle of civil rights, but also to the Democratic Party, where he was, at the time, a revolutionary figure coming out of nowhere, coming out of the Deep South, what he means to the American story.
In order to understand what he meant, you have to understand the context. In 1972, the Democratic Party nominee was George McGovern. It was considered very liberal. I remember I was 17 years old at the time. I was Shirley Chisholm's youth director. She ran in those primaries. Then right after the 72 race, where Nixon won overwhelmingly by landslide, we have Watergate. And the whole country is embarrassed, humiliated. We're in the middle of trying to deal with the war in Vietnam. Here comes this moral, soft-spoken man who had integrity and character that came out of nowhere and started winning primaries and won. He was born and raised in the Deep South. His parents had been segregationists. He himself had an evolving relationship with the black community. He became very good friends with Martin Luther King Sr. He didn't know Dr. King Jr. Martin Luther King III, and I talk about it often. Mrs. King, Coretta Scott King, and him became close. I've talked to her about him. And here was a man from the deep South talking about civil rights and human rights and standing up for what was right and stabilizing the country and returning a moral character to the White House. So you have to understand the Democratic Party being traumatized with the McGovern loss. Then we run into Watergate. Then we're still dealing with war. And here comes a man that was a man of faith. In the times that I met with him and talked to him, I'll never forget that at the 50th anniversary of the 63 March on Washington, 2013, I got in a conversation with President Clinton and President Carter. And at the end of the conversation, Carter said to me, Al, I see you out there with your activism. You're still preaching, right? I said, oh, I'm at a church every Sunday. I don't pastor a church. I, took Reverend Jesse Jackson's tradition, not pastoring, but moving around like Dr. King co-pastor. I said, but I'm in church every Sunday preaching, and I'm as studious as the Bible as I always was. He said, don't forget your faith. Don't ever leave your ministry. Let your civil rights work be your ministry. This guy lived what he talked. He practiced what he preached.
Yeah, beautiful words there. So, Chris, in your latest op-ed for the Washington Post has the headline, Jimmy Carter had an outsider edge. You wrote in part this: at the age of 28, I ran and lost a Democratic primary for Congress. It was not, however, for naught. That wild campaign against Philadelphia's old political machine won me an unlikely ally. The news came in a letter urging that I stay actively involved in Democratic politics. More seductive still, it contained an out-and-out request for my future help in building the party. And it was signed Jimmy Carter. So, Chris, talk to us a little more about that moment in your life, how Jimmy Carter, offered his assistance, and just what a revolutionary figure he was, including after his presidency, where he, I'd argue, has done more than anyone else who's ever held the office.
Well, it started young. To follow up on what Reverend Al said so well. He was brought up among all African-American kids. All his friends were African-American. He was the only white kid in the crowd, if you will. They would fish together. They'd play games together. They'd build toys together. They were rural kids, no running water, no electricity. I mean, the only outside influence Jimmy Carter had from the real world, the larger world, was that he would go to sleep in the evening, have an alarm set for 8 o'clock so he could get up and listen to Glenn Miller from the 1940s. That's what he remembered as his outside influence. But the rest of it was rural. It was black. It was the people of the country. And later on, as you say, what he did with his post-presidency was go back to Plains, basically, back to Atlanta, and build this huge effort to try to bring cures to diseases most Americans are lucky to have never heard of, like guinea worm in Africa. And he would go over these places that we'll probably never visit and help people improve their lives. So I think he was a rural guy. He told me once, I never really liked the big city. I said, why didn't you end up in New York like the Clintons? That's what everybody does. Douglas MacArthur, all the big shots end up in New York. And he said, I don't feel too comfortable in New York. I don't feel comfortable with the big shots of the Democratic Party like Averell Harriman in the old days. He was not a big shot. And I would say that's the best tribute we can give to this former president. He was not a big shot. He did not see the American presidency as a transaction where you get something from it. You give a little, but you get a lot more from it. He never looked at it that way. He saw it as giving. And there he is with this Habitat for Humanity. I saw him down in Tijuana, Mexico. It was nice weather down there, I must say. We all slept out on the ground. But he was out there, and Roosevelt was out there with their hauling 2x4s around. And Roosevelt had a nail apron on. They were, look at them, look at these people. This is not a PR stunt, a photo op. They're building houses that really people lived in. And so I think he had a lot of that rural attitude that he never lost. It's no surprise that he ended up dying and living in Plains.